using some random files from the sample models folder. So if any of you guys want to follow along, it's not a particularly like interactive demo. It really is just sort of showing you some render settings for things. But I'll be using this flashlight folder here. So if you want to download that in advance, you can. All right, so in terms of setting up a turntable, first thing I'm going to do is just grab my generic head model that I've been using for legitimately like every demo in class because I'm a spaz. All right, so we have this glorious head model. I'm just going to do a mesh combine because I'm feeling super lazy. Actually, okay, fine. I'll group it like a real person. All right, so first thing I expect for this is some kind of platform for this to sit on. In this case, the simplest thing I can possibly do is basically just make this a weird little cylindrical platform. So this is like pretty much the bare minimum expectation that I have is a disk, an unsmoothed disk. It would be nice if you wanted to go through and like add in, if your model is low poly, this makes potentially less sense to smooth it, but you know, you could go in and add a little bit of like molding detail or something, some other type of like visual interest to this. So I'm just gonna run through and just sort of like add another loop and add another loop, and like usually if I'm setting up a turntable, I'll just sort of do something really just like gross and simple like this. But even this does kind of help to give a little bit of just like extra visual interest and detail to the platform and make it look less like an afterthought and more like something that was intentional. So again, you can just sort of go through and add the least fancy molding ever, but oh god, just even something like this totally looks nicer than whatever I had like 10 seconds ago. It even almost kind of smooths. But anywho, so again, just put your thing on some kind of platform. When you do that, also please make sure that your object is not clipping aggressively through the platform like this head is. So I'm just going to drag this group up, and I can do one of two things. So I can just sort of like position it sort of randomly and like hope that it's not clipping. If I wanted to be fancy about it and ensure that it's not clipping, what I can do is press D to edit the pivot, V to vert snap, and just drag that pivot down to the bottom vertex in that face. Now if I just press and hold V and just move this down, I can snap it directly to the top of that and ensure that it is not clipping. It also looks like I may have not made this flat, which is awkward, but anywho. But yeah, so again, put your thing on a platform. Other things, again, I'm just looking for like a wall setup. So in this case, I'm just gonna be like pretty hardcore lazy and just make a cube. Make a cube. What am I, oh, turn off symmetry. Make hideous looking cube and bevel edges. I'm just gonna use Control B because I like hotkeys, dear God. Great. 0.1, cool, close enough. And then I'll just mesh display reverse this so I'm not looking at the inside of a cube. So this is like something like pretty easy, just like cruddy little setup that looks a little bit nicer than just sort of, again, like having an object floating on a plane suspended over a HDR. So any questions about this in terms of like what I'm expecting for like walls and a platform? All right. So in terms of actually making the thing behave like a turntable, I'm just going to throw in kind of some whatever lighting. I'm not going to do anything. I'd use the HDR I have, but it is so hideous that I actually can't bring myself to do it. So I'm just going to throw in a physical sky, and where is it? Just rotate that slightly so that the sun is actually coming onto my face. That is close enough. I'm going to say that's halfway decent lighting. It's like not the greatest, but whatever. I'm not going to lie, I have become very fond of the physical sky. All right, so in terms of actually making this, again, behave like a turntable where the head is actually spinning, it's just a little bit about how to go over keyframes. If you had me last quarter, I'm pretty sure I went through like pretty much all of this, but I'll re-go through it again just in case you guys need a refresher. So grab your, in this case, my head group. but grab whatever your object is, and you're going to need to set a keyframe at frame 1. Basically have the thing spin around and end at basically the same position on a later frame. So usually I'm just going to go in, grabbing my head group. I can't leave it like that. It's like bothering me. So I just want to set a keyframe. I'm just going to rotate this directly around the y-axis, so I only need to key the rotation y. So I just click on the text of rotate y, right-click, and do key selected. So you can see, can everyone see the time slider at the bottom, by the way? Okay. Alright, so you can see it's, again, put in a little keyframe right here, this little red line, and it's also set this little red bar next to the rotation Y. So that's the only thing that's been keyed. You could also just hit S, it'll key everything. For turntables, mostly that's what I do. For animation, it tends to be good to only key what you need, otherwise you just end up with like a billion stray keyframes and it's horrible to work with. But yeah, so again, set a keyframe on frame 1. Normally for turntables, you need to render at least 360 frames, so basically 1 frame per degree of rotation that this head is spinning. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to set the, right now I only have 200 frames in my scene, I'm going to just set that to 360. So if you wanted to be like super fancy with your turntables, you could render 720 frames, so you have 2 frames for each degree of rotation, but realistically, no one's going to do that. So shrugs. But again, 360 is kind of the minimum I do, otherwise stuff ends up turning so fast you just like can't tell what the heck is happening. Alright, so I'm going to go over to frame 360, and I want to type in 360 into my rotate. So basically, again, 1 degree of rotation per frame. You can see when I did that, it doesn't look like my model moved at all. I'm just going to right click on rotate Y again and do key selected, and this is on frame 360. But you'll notice now that if I scrub through this, my object is spinning around in space, all nice and fun. If I play this, you can see, again, it's just sort of spinning. Yay. Alright, so any questions on this so far? Alright. So the bit I said about make sure that your object is rotating on like a logical pivot. So I made this pivot even worse just to make a point. So like this is an example of a object rotating in a way that makes no sense at all. Where you can see like I deliberately put the pivot outside of the body so that as it spins, the whole body is just like sliding around this one point in space, which ends up looking really weird. It's like going off the corners of my little table thing that I've made, and it looks horrible in so many levels. So to fix that, just again, make sure that you shift your pivot somewhere that makes sense. Sometimes doing modify center pivot works for an object, sometimes it makes more sense to place it manually. It just depends on the object. So again, I'm just going to go press and hold D to access my pivot, just drag that somewhere into the center-ish of my object, and I'm just going to shift this so it's a little bit centered on my platform. And when I rotate this now, you can see that it's not spinning as crazily as it was before. So again, just like make sure that you're paying attention to like where that stuff rotates from. An example of a time where like modify center pivot is going to give you a terrible result for a turntable is actually something like a teapot. I swear to God, Maya, if you crash on me right now, I will hurt you. Why can I only select certain menu options? So not cool. Alright. But anywho, I'll find a picture of a teapot on Google, so help me. But that's gonna give you, so like, if you're spinning a teapot, you'd probably expect, here we go. You'd expect to just like rotate pretty much like the circular base is just gonna stay planted where it is. But if you did modify center pivot on this, it would probably, or something like this is even worse. So it has a spout sticking out, so the technical center of this object is somewhere like right here, instead of right here. So again, that might be somewhere where you need to like modify it manually, it just really depends on your object. Any questions on that? Cool. Alright, so I think the next thing is basically just render settings. So for rendering, you can have the computer go through and like render each frame for you, so you don't need to go through and like manually render 300 frames because that's the worst thing ever. So if we go into your render settings, you can select if you want to like rename your file name. In this case, I really don't care at all, so I'm just going to leave this the way it is. Actually, perfect. Image format, I like using TIFFs. EXRs are like probably the nicest thing you can use, but TIFFs are nice because they give you enough data to work with, and you have a little more editing capabilities later. And then if I'm using a TIFF, I use float32, because A, it gives me the most data to work with in terms of post-processing, but also using float32 will pretty much ensure that you don't have any weird issues where like your renders save darker than they looked on the viewport. And then I more or less ignore all the color space stuff, unless there's like a specific thing that I need there. So the next thing, and this is going to unlock a bunch of options for you guys. So the frame/animation extension, by default, it's name.ext, and you can see that it's marked this for a single frame. What you need if you want to render, like batch render a turntable or something like that, is to select almost any of these options that don't say single frame next to them, because anything with single frame is not going to render multiple frames at once. But also these gray out other options. So my preferred one is name_number.extension. For some reason, they give you the option to do name.extension.number, which is ridiculous, and I don't, that is like the only one that I've had consistent issues breaking computers if I've tried to use that, because the extension's not the last thing and doesn't know how to open that, so don't choose that one. Again, I like this one, so I usually just use name_number. And you'll notice as soon as I click on that, it opens up some other options for frame padding and like start and end frame, all that good stuff. So in this case, frame padding is just not super important. It's just the number of zeros it's going to put before your number, so I usually leave this as somewhere like 2 or 3. You need it higher if you're rendering like frames in the thousands, stuff like that. But it doesn't really hurt anything in my experience to kind of have it as a random number. The next thing you're going to want to pay attention to is the start and end frame. So as you might expect from the name, the start frame is which frame do you want to start rendering on. The end frame is which frame do you want to stop rendering on. So in this case, I have frame 1, which is where I started my animation, and I want to stop this not at frame 10, but at frame 360. 360. And then the by frame, this is basically, if you set it to 1, it's going to go through and render every frame. So it's going to render frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4. If I set this to something like, if I set this to 2 or to 5, so I'll just do 2, that's going to render frame 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. So in the case of your homework today, since you only need to render every 25th frame, you can just set this to 25 and it's automatically going to render the correct frames for your sequence. Skip existing frames is pretty much if there's already a frame that exists under this file name that you're trying to render, it'll just ignore that and not render the frame. So you know, if your computer crashes halfway through or whatever and you're like, I don't need to re-render these 40 frames because I have them already, just click existing frames and it'll not re-render those. The rest of it is pretty much the same thing as we've been doing before. So renderable camera, if you set up a specific camera for your turntable, you can select that here so it doesn't render out of like your perspective camera randomly. Image size, all that good stuff. Pretty much the standard thing there. So are there any questions about that? All right. So now that I have this set up in the way that I want, I'm going to go in and show you guys how to actually set up the batch render. To do that, you need to go out of your modeling menu and into your rendering menu. You will then have this lovely little render tab on the top. And if you open that, there are 2 settings you need to use depending on the renderer you're using. So you're either going to use render sequence or batch render. And this is actually important because if your stuff is watermarked, I will totally take points off for that. And depending, again, on what setting you use and the render engine, it'll watermark your stuff. So for Arnold, you need to use render sequence. If you use batch render in Arnold, it will put giant watermarks on all of your stuff. So for Arnold, please use render sequence. when I do that, I'm just going to pull this up in advance. So I'm going to open the settings for this. If you want to, you can override settings from your render settings. Like I could choose a different camera or like whatever. For the most part, I just set my render settings to do what they want, and then I just go. So I'm going to render sequence and close. And you can see that it is just sort of going through, and it's not going to only click on anything, but it's just sort of going through and systematically rendering. You can see it's skipping from frame 71 or 51 to 76 to 101. So it is going through and just rendering every 25th frame. And if I go into my, I'm like 80% sure that I'm saving these here. I am, huzzah. So you can see that it's actually going through and, oh, and I can open TIFFs on the computer, but I can't open PNGs, so we actually can open these. But you can see it's going through and just, again, systematically rendering every 25th frame of this horrible little turntable that I've just set up. And that is just going to keep doing that, so I'm going to, it's almost done. What the heck? All right, cool. But again, so you can see it's just sort of gone through and, you know, rendered all of the frames that would be required for the homework assignment today. Obviously, make sure that your stuff is rendered at full HD and not this tiny one. I just did this for speed. So any questions on that? All right. The last thing that I wanted to go over that I actually completely forgot to go over is, so I went over the bit about the pivot that I was like, make sure your pivot is centered. I forgot to go over the bit about, what the heck, making sure that your thing spins at a constant speed. So I'm going to go through really quick and just speed up my animation because it'll make this a little bit more obvious. Oh God, why are you doing this, Maya? Okay. This is super annoying. All right, I'm going to save this really quick and just like close Maya, but what if you save it in scenes? Because that's logical. All right. Maya's gone nuts. And I do actually, I had to like reinstall Redshift, which IT totally said was not going to be a thing, but it was, but anyway. But you'll notice if any of you guys have been playing along with this, or done turntables before, or like worked with animations before. So Maya does a thing where it likes to try to smooth out your keyframes so that it basically starts really slow and then ends really slow. So help me, Maya. Do I have? Yay, I can click on my file menu now. That's exciting. Baby steps. But basically it creates a strange effect in turntables where, and I'll show you in a second, where when it starts, it's like really slow. Halfway through the animation, it'll start turning faster, and then like right towards the end, it'll get really slow again. So for one, oh my God. It looks kind of awkward when that happens. And it also just kind of like isn't terribly polished looking. No. Wait. Seriously? Weird. Anyway. Still not sure why I can't click on half of my buttons. Anyone ever had that issue before where you just like straight up can't click on half of your menu options? Okay. Fantastic. The fact that this is like the industry standard and it's so buggy is terrifying to me. But anywho, so again, I'm just gonna grab this keyframe and sort of randomly shift it down to frame like 160 or something. All right, so this is gonna be a lot more obvious what the actual issue is. So I'm gonna go ahead and play this, and you'll notice again, it starts slow, gets like pretty fast, slows down, stops pretty much, and then starts again. So this is, again, what you want to avoid in turntables because it doesn't look particularly professional and it also makes it really obvious where it's looping. The fix for this is actually fairly straightforward. So just select whatever object you have keyed, go to Windows. Well, this is horribly distracting. All right. Ha ha ha. All right. If your menus ever break, that's what the space key is for, apparently. And by space key, I mean space bar. I don't know what I just said there. So anyway, Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. So again, it's Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. And it's going to pull up this thing. Whenever you take animation classes, this will be your best friend. And I'm speaking from someone who like went through 3 animation classes refusing to use this. You should totally just familiarize yourself with it early. It makes everything so much easier. It's a little weird to like start working with, but once you start using it, it will be your best friend ever. But basically, with this opened, if I select my little head, my head group, you'll see basically a visual representation of the change in the Y rotation that I've set this keyframe for. And I'm not going to go like super explain like how this works, but like basically you can kind of see here where like it's very little rotation. So this is the number of keyframes that you have here, and then the degrees of rotation on the y-axis. So you can see there's like a very small change, speeds up pretty dramatically, and then gets less change over longer time. Basically, you just want this to go straight from point A to point B. And to do that, there's a little button up here with all the little, there's like a bunch of squiggly orange lines with some dots in it. The one you're looking for is a straight line, and if you mouse over it, it's called linear tangents. So if I'm just gonna click anywhere in my graph editor, drag, it'll select my little points here, and just click that linear tangents button. You'll notice as soon as I did that, that curvy line becomes a straight line. And now if I go through and play this turntable, you can see that where it's looping, it goes at a constant speed, and it's not doing that weird thing where it's like basically stopping. This also loops way better now. But again, that's something it's a little hard to tell this from the stills, but I'd recommend just setting up and being done with it. But this is something that I will be looking for on your final turntables. So are there any questions on that? Huzzah! Save this because I can. All right, any other questions on any of the homework stuff before I wander away? Cool. All right, bless you. All right, so the next thing that I want to go over